Hello there, I'm Colin Breckles with Castlebreck. This is part one in a series dealing with file-based routing, static site generation, server-side rendering, and some related issues. So in this part, we're going to talk about rendering, particularly starting at the very basics with static HTML and old school server-side apps. And then in subsequent parts, we move on to server-side rendering, static site generation, and some frameworks like Next.js and Vike and others. So let's get right into it. First, I'd like to thank David, the creator of the Developer Safe Place on Discord, who organized a great event that we had on January 8th, and Absolute and Manesse, who helped prepare for that event. Thank you kindly to all of you for your great help. And as requirements, here's what we talked about as requirements motivating the decisions about technology and architecture choices. And some of you may share these requirements. So we like file-based routing. It's become very convenient and loved in React applications. And when you're doing file-based routing, you still want client-side routing to maintain state on page transitions, so not a full page load. So you want deep links, you want the ability to maintain client-side state on page transitions. You want the ability to do static site generation where it's necessary. It's not always necessary, nor, in our opinion, is server-side rendering always necessary. The ability to have a separate backend. Many people have API applications like REST APIs or other types of APIs that are completely separate from their front-end app. They want to keep them that way. They want to develop them, scale them, monitor them, deploy them independently and not have an all-in-one front-end backend. And many of those apps are written in other languages, Java, .NET, any manner of other things, or even a separate JavaScript or TypeScript app that's just not the same app. Some customers don't want a node interpreter at runtime and prod either. That could be a requirement for certain organizations, or it's redundant with the existing backend. It's our hypothesis, it's become a working hypothesis that websites requiring SEO have a special class of requirements that may not apply to other types of apps. And so for websites requiring SEO, you'll want to follow the core web vitals that Google publish on web.dev. These are currently largest contentful paint, LCP, which is how long does it take until the largest element that needs to get painted is loaded and painted. The first input delay. So how long does it take until the page or app becomes responsive to user input? And cumulative layout shift. So if you've ever seen a page load, maybe there's placeholders for images that weren't unsized, and then things on the page start to jump around as the page gets loaded. That's what we're talking about there. They'll penalize you for that. And so core web vitals matter a lot if you want your page to rank. So if this is a website requiring SEO, these things matter a lot. Some of these align to a good user experience, so it's not to discount them. It's just that certain aspects of it aren't as important when it's not a website requiring SEO. So if we're talking about enterprise apps or SaaS applications, a slightly longer load time may be okay. We're not talking about a brutally long load time. It's just not 400 milliseconds. So if this is an app that a user is a repeat user over and over, it could mean a couple things. It could mean that files are cached locally in the browser, and it may also mean long session times. They load that app and leave it running all day long. Consequently, what becomes more important to that user is the responsiveness and performance after the first page load, not necessarily first page load performance, which is paramount when you hit a new web property you've never visited. Let's talk about rendering. By rendering, we mean where does HTML markup get generated, or where does the DOM manipulation happen to hydrate the DOM in response, if it's a framework app like a React app. So rendering is HTML or DOM. First, we're going to contrast it with static HTML files. So you don't typically hand code static HTML files as much anymore, unless it's pretty trivial. But for comparison, if you hand coded a simple index.html and placed it on a web server, let's talk about what happens. Web servers have welcome pages defined, and so index.html being a common welcome page or a welcome file. And so when the browser makes a request to the web server, and the request is /, so it's just the host portion and nothing after it, then that web server will look in the configured document root and find the index.html and send it. Okay, now when the browser requests after the host portion /subfolder 1, underneath the document root, it sees subfolder 1 and streams the contents of that index.html back to the browser. Noteworthy is that whatever is in that index.html file, that's what gets sent to the browser, and that HTML doesn't need to be hydrated or anything because it's already coded. It's already got the HTML inside that file. Compare this with old school server-side apps with no client-side rendering. So these apps, the older generation of apps, the first dynamic apps that weren't coded HTML files, when the browser made a request that would first hit the web server, which would then perhaps reverse proxy it to an app server, the app server, in response to that request, would do whatever was appropriate based on that request and generate a new full page response. Now, the response being not JSON, like calling an API, but HTML. So it generates a full HTML for a page response and sends that back. This differs a lot from modern frameworks. So the next thing we're going to talk about is client-side rendering in React applications, like particularly SPA. So we'll leave this video here and continue on with the next one.